December 17, 1944, the Ardennes forest. The air is still frozen. Smoke from shattered tree lines drifts low over the snow. German field officers scan the white horizon from a ridge outside St. Vith. Only hours ago, the valley below had roared with the thunder of American guns, relentless, rhythmic, unbroken. Now silence. The Americans have vanished. Through binoculars, a lieutenant sees only black craters and twisted shell casings. They pulled back, he mutters. But the coordinates don't make sense. The U.S. positions were surrounded by German advance units just last night. How could the artillery be gone? Moments later, the stillness is shattered again. From the opposite direction, miles away, across ridges the Germans believed impassable, came a rolling thunder of shells. Explosions ripple through their own rear lines. German maps are useless. Radio intercepts fail to keep up. It's as if the American artillery has learned to teleport, appearing, firing, and fading into the fog before a single counterstrike can land. To Hitler's generals, it seemed like trickery. To the men on the ground, it was something else entirely, the terrifying precision of an army that had mastered mobility and deception through sheer calculation. And this is where the mystery began. By the summer of 1944, the tide of war in Europe had turned. The Allies had broken through the beaches of Normandy, driven inland, and shattered the myth of Hitler's fortress Europe. What followed was not the swift triumph many expected, but a grinding, technical, and deeply mathematical phase of the war, one fought less by tanks and more by the thunder of distant guns. Every army of the Second World War relied on artillery. It was the great equalizer, the weapon that decided where men lived or died before they even saw the enemy. In France, the scale was overwhelming. U.S. divisions advanced behind rolling barrages that consumed thousands of shells each day. Their 105 and 155 guns lined hedgerows, village edges, and open fields. The thunder never stopped. For the Germans, who had spent years perfecting their own doctrine of firepower, this came as a shock. They had always respected artillery, but theirs was bound to the slow rhythm of horse-drawn guns, rail transport, and rigid command structures. By contrast, American artillery seemed to breathe. It shifted, adapted, and fired from new angles almost every day. Behind this flexibility was a simple idea: mobility through precision. American gunners didn't just fire more shells, they fired smarter. Where the German batteries needed detailed survey lines and pre-registered maps, U.S. units learned to compute coordinates in the field, on the move. A gun could unhook from a position, drive 10 miles, and begin firing again in less than an hour. The heart of this efficiency was organization. The U.S. Army had built an artillery machine unlike any seen before. Each infantry division carried its own fully motorized artillery battalions, linked by an intricate network of radio communication. Above them, corps and army-level artillery could be reassigned minute by minute to wherever the front demanded. If one sector fell silent, another erupted as if a single mind were directing 1,000 guns. By mid-1944, this adaptability had begun to change the course of engagements. German counter-battery fire, once deadly, now often struck empty fields. Shells landed on coordinates already abandoned. U.S. gunners had vanished before the first retaliatory shot. American innovation didn't come from magic. It came from process. Every battery operated like a laboratory of mathematics. Range tables, firing charts, weather corrections, and time-of-flight data were recorded and recalculated constantly. The men who served the guns were not just soldiers. They were technicians of destruction. They learned to read the terrain, to understand the exact second a shell would strike, to shift position before the enemy even triangulated their location. And still, to the Germans watching through field glasses, it looked supernatural. Guns would appear in a valley at dawn, open fire for 10 minutes, then vanish into the fog. Hours later, the same regiment's fire would rain down from an entirely different direction, sometimes more than 20 miles away. For Hitler's generals, this phenomenon defied logic. Their intelligence officers scoured reports for explanations. Were the Americans using decoy guns, dummy fires, secret railway lines? The truth was far simpler and far more terrifying for an army built on discipline and order. The Americans had mastered fluid warfare. The stage was set for the great winter confrontation where this mastery would be tested against the last German gamble of the war. In the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, thousands of American artillerymen would execute the ultimate test of their doctrine: firing, vanishing and firing again while the enemy hunted shadows. But before the Ardennes erupted, this evolution had a deeper story born not in winter, but in the dusty fields of France, where American engineers rewrote how artillery moved, aimed, and survived. The roots of America's artillery revolution stretched back years before the guns thundered across France. By the early 1940s, the U.S. Army had already begun to reimagine the very idea of artillery warfare. Mobility was no longer a luxury, it was doctrine. The old static gun lines of the First World War had proven deadly for those who couldn't move. Now the battlefield demanded speed, flexibility, and coordination across miles of chaos. At the heart of this transformation was a single concept: centralized control, decentralized execution. American artillery units could act independently in the field, yet remain perfectly synchronized through an invisible web of communication. Field telephones, FM radios, and forward observers formed a network that allowed instant target requests without waiting for chain-of-command approvals. A lieutenant in a foxhole could call for fire, and within minutes, guns from several battalions would converge their shells on a single coordinate. This system became known as time on target, or TOT. It was the essence of American precision. Every gun, whether 105mm howitzer or 155mm long tom, would calculate the exact moment its shell needed to be fired so that all rounds, from every position, struck the target at the same second. The effect was devastating. Enemy units hit simultaneously with no warning, no time to dive for cover. The first sound they heard was the explosion itself. But TOT was only one part of the puzzle. The other was mobility, and this came from engineering genius. American artillery was motorized to an extent unmatched by any army on Earth. Each gun was towed by a powerful 1 or 2 ton truck or half-track, capable of moving over mud, rubble, and snow. Later, self-propelled guns like the M7 Priest and the M12 added another layer of freedom. Guns could move, stop fire, and move again without ever disconnecting. This gave rise to what gunners began calling shoot and scoot: fire a mission, relocate before the enemy could respond, and be ready for the next call. It wasn't just survival, it was strategy. Every German counter-battery radar, every sound-ranging team was rendered obsolete by the time it found its mark. To coordinate these movements required more than machinery. It demanded leadership that understood the rhythm of artillery warfare. Commanders like General Jacob L. Devers, General Omar Bradley, and General Patton recognized artillery not merely as support, but as the decisive arm of maneuver. Patton famously called artillery the god of war. But unlike the static gods of old, this one moved with his tanks. Behind the front lines, teams of engineers built intricate road networks, pontoon bridges, and refueling stations to keep the gun battalions flowing. Every movement was timed with mechanical precision. When German spotter planes tried to track these columns, camouflage nets and deceptive convoys disguised real batteries among decoys. Aerial reconnaissance might count 20 trucks, but only half carried guns. The rest were empty frames designed to mislead. In the fields of Normandy and the Bocage of France, this system matured under fire. American divisions learned to leapfrog their artillery units while one fired. Another moved forward to a new position, keeping the advance continuous. The Germans began to complain and intercepted radio traffic. The Americans have more guns than we can count. They appear, fire, and vanish again. By autumn 1944, when Allied forces approached the Siegfried Line, this reputation had hardened into legend. German field reports spoke of wandering batteries, ghost guns, and phantom barrages. None of it was supernatural. It was logistics, coordination, and an army that had finally mastered the synchronization of science and war. Still, the real test was yet to come. When Hitler launched his final counteroffensive in the Ardennes that December, the Germans believed they could overwhelm thin American lines before artillery could react. They were wrong. What followed would cement the legend when U.S. guns disappeared into smoke, only to reappear miles away, hammering from unseen ridges. And so, as the snow fell over the Ardennes and German tanks rolled westward, the Americans prepared to fight not by holding ground, but by mastering the shadows through fire, movement, and precision. Every battery had its own rhythm, men and machines moving as one. A U.S. artillery crew in 1944 was a blend of exhaustion, precision, and trust. They worked in mud, snow, and flame, often sleeping beside their guns with helmets as pillows. To them, the artillery wasn't just a weapon. It was a living system that demanded discipline, calculation, and nerves of steel. A typical gun crew numbered 8 to 10 men. Each had a task: the loader, the gunner, the range setter, the section chief. When a fire mission came through the radio, voices didn't rise, they sharpened. Coordinates shouted over wind and battle noise were instantly converted into mechanical motion. Wheels turned, barrels elevated, fuses set. Within seconds, the command came: fire. The concussion hit like a physical blow. Even veterans flinched. Shell after shell screamed into the fog, the ground trembling with every recoil. Yet amid this chaos was a quiet professionalism, the kind born not from aggression but from exactness. These men weren't hunters. They were craftsmen. Every calculation, every correction, meant the difference between saving their infantry or missing by yards. But when the order came to move, the transformation was instant. In less than 20 minutes, entire batteries could break down, load up, and roll out. The soldiers joked that they were part mathematician, part truck driver, part magician. To the Germans who tried to strike back, these gunners simply ceased to exist before counterfire arrived. What looked like magic from afar was, in reality, the outcome of strict tactical doctrine. The phrase "shoot and scoot" became second nature to American artillerymen by late 1944. The rule was simple: never fire from the same spot twice. The reason was deadly clear: German radar and sound-ranging teams could locate a gun line within minutes if it stayed put. The U.S. Army developed intricate patterns for mobility. Each battery had pre-planned fallback positions, alternate fire sites, and carefully mapped routes to avoid ambush or congestion. Engineers worked alongside artillery officers to ensure every potential site offered concealment, solid ground, and clear firing arcs. Once a mission ended, vehicles were loaded with rehearsed speed. Gun crews rode atop ammunition crates. Convoy lights blacked out to avoid Luftwaffe patrols. Movement often happened at night, the columns stretching silently through villages and forests. When dawn came, new positions were already established, range tables recalculated, fire control centers updated, communication lines reconnected. This constant movement had another purpose: deception. German intelligence depended heavily on predicting enemy patterns, but the Americans gave them none. Even when the Germans tried to time artillery barrages to track movement cycles, U.S. units deliberately broke their own rhythm, sometimes waiting hours before moving, other times firing 2 missions in quick succession from different directions. In effect, the battlefield became a chessboard of moving firepower. Infantry and armor advanced under the protection of an artillery umbrella that seemed omnipresent, striking from anywhere and nowhere all at once. Behind the mobility was a revolution in mathematics and machinery. The U.S., the Army, had turned gunnery into a science, and the secret lay in its fire control systems. Portable computing devices such as the M18 plotting board and field ballistic calculators allowed crews to perform complex trigonometric calculations on site. These innovations reduced setup time from hours to minutes. Radar, too, began to play a crucial role. American counter-battery radar units could detect incoming shells, trace their trajectory backward, and instantly locate the enemy gun's position. This information was relayed to nearby batteries, which could fire back before the Germans even moved. The introduction of proximity fuses added yet another layer of deadliness. Tiny radar sensors inside each shell detonated the explosive at a precise height above the ground, turning every burst into a perfect airburst shower of steel. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, this technology tore through German infantry caught in the open, convincing many survivors that the Americans had invented a new kind of weapon altogether. And yet, the brilliance of the system was not in the individual devices. It was in the integration. Radios linked forward observers to command posts, which linked to firing batteries, which relayed back through radar and reconnaissance networks. It was a closed-loop one that operated faster than the German command chain could comprehend. To an outside observer, it appeared that the American artillery could see, think, and move as a single organism. But to the men who made it happen, It was simply the result of endless training and coordination, a harmony of engineering and instinct. Through human grit, tactical fluidity, and technological precision, American artillery had become something unseen in any previous war, a moving, thinking weapon. And yet, to understand how deeply this shook the German army, one must look through the eyes of the men trying to fight it. For the German High Command, American artillery had become an enigma. Reports arriving at Army Group B headquarters in late 1944 were filled with contradictions. Frontline officers described entire gun lines that had vanished overnight. Counter-battery units relying on sound ranging and flash spotting found only empty fields. When shells began falling again, they came from entirely different coordinates. Sometimes from behind terrain the Germans considered impassable for heavy guns. To the Wehrmacht's gunners, this was infuriating. German artillerymen prided themselves on precision, but their system was built for fixed warfare. They needed prepared positions, established supply lines, and long setup times. Once in place, their guns were devastating but immobile. Every time they faced American batteries, they were reacting to ghosts. Intelligence officers began speculating about new Allied technology. Some believed the Americans were using decoy fires or rail-mounted guns hidden in tunnels. Others blamed Allied air superiority. Perhaps reconnaissance planes were guiding artillery from the sky, but no explanation seemed to fit. The truth that the Americans had simply outpaced them in logistics, coordination, and mobility was harder to accept. Captured after the war, several German officers reflected bitterly on this experience. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded 5th Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge, admitted that the speed and flexibility of American artillery support made maneuvering extremely difficult. To him and many others, the U.S. gunners had erased the boundaries between front and rear, between offense and defense. Their firepower seemed to materialize wherever German troops dared to move. Behind this transformation stood leaders who understood that artillery was not just firepower, it was tempo. General Omar Bradley, the quiet architect of much of the U.S. Army's success in Western Europe, believed artillery coordination was the key to victory. He encouraged pooling, merging the firepower of multiple divisions into flexible groups that could concentrate overwhelming force at any given point. General George S. Patton took this further. His Third Army, advancing across France, operated with a rhythm few opponents could match. Patton demanded that his artillery move as fast as his tanks. If armor advanced 10 miles in a day, the guns had to advance 10 miles as well, ready to fire within hours. He often said, "My men can't win unless my guns can move." His artillery officers delivered exactly that. Another critical figure was Brigadier General Orlando Ward, head of the artillery section of the Army Ground Forces. Ward championed the training and standardization that made mobility possible, teaching units to break camp, calculate new firing data, and resume operations at record speed. By late 1944, American divisions could relocate and begin firing again faster than many German units could even transmit orders. The genius of these leaders was not in inventing new weapons, but in orchestrating systems turning radio operators, truck drivers, and gunners into a single instrument of war. Their mindset was modern, almost predictive of future warfare, speed, coordination, and information as the decisive elements of power. For soldiers on both sides, artillery wasn't just a weapon, it was an environment. To the Germans, it was the sound of terror, barrages erupting without warning, often from unseen directions. Survivors of American fire missions spoke of the unbearable pressure, the feeling that the very air was alive with steel. The unpredictable rhythm broke morale. You couldn't fight what you couldn't find. For American troops, the feeling was different. The thunder of their own guns was reassuring, the invisible shield that meant survival. Infantrymen advancing through the hedgerows of France or the frozen woods of Belgium often said the same words. Our guns are still with us. They trusted that somewhere behind them, unseen, the artillery was watching, ready to answer. The psychological power of this faith cannot be overstated. It turned exhaustion into endurance. Units pinned down by German armor held their positions longer, knowing help would arrive not from the sky, but from the earth itself in the shape of timed, coordinated, precision fire. The Germans, by contrast, began to lose their sense of certainty. Officers hesitated to mass troops or vehicles, fearing instant destruction. Convoys moved by night, often too late to effect the battle. What had once been a confident mechanized army found itself crawling under cover, haunted by the possibility that American guns could find them anywhere. This mental shift was one of the hidden victories of the Allied campaign. The Americans didn't just destroy enemy positions, they dismantled the German army's sense of control. And by the winter of 1944, as the last great German offensive prepared to strike through the Ardennes, this imbalance would reach its breaking point. The Germans hoped for surprise, but surprise had long since become the Americans' greatest weapon. The stage was set for a test of doctrine and nerve clash between German mass and American mobility. December 16, 1944. Dawn breaks gray and cold over the Ardennes. From the German side, more than 1,600 artillery pieces opened fire in a single, deafening moment, the prelude to Hitler's final gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. For the American soldiers caught in the initial bombardment, it feels like the sky itself is collapsing. Shells pound positions from Monschau to Luxembourg. Snow erupts from frozen ground. Trees are splintered into flying shrapnel. In the chaos, communication lines snap. Roads are choked and fog blinds reconnaissance planes. Hitler's plan depends on that fog of confusion. The Germans intend to drive a wedge through the Allied front, cross the Meuse River and seize Antwerp. They need speed, shock, and above all, American paralysis. But the paralysis never comes. In the opening hours, the U.S. artillery network, cut, fragmented, and surrounded in places, refuses to break. Batteries begin shifting positions even before German tanks arrive. Trucks roar through snow-clogged forest roads, towing howitzers under blackout conditions. Some crews abandon tents and gear, keeping only their guns and fuel. At first it seemed like a retreat, but it isn't. Its maneuver under fire was the purest expression of the doctrine forged in Normandy. Within hours, those same guns begin to reappear, miles behind new defensive lines, perfectly oriented and firing again. The Germans, who overrun their old positions, find only warm shell casings and tire tracks disappearing into the woods. In the sector around St. Vith, this dance reaches its most dramatic form. American artillery units, notably the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion and the 106th Division's gun groups, perform continuous displacement under combat conditions. While German panzers push through Schnee-Eifel, U.S. gunners reposition every few hours, firing mission after mission from new coordinates. Each time the Germans triangulate their location, the guns have already gone. Counterfire lands on empty snow. When the next American salvo comes, it's from behind. Across valleys the enemy thought clear. For frontline infantry, this mobility means survival. Entire regiments under siege are kept alive by artillery that seems omnipresent. When communications falter, forward observers climb trees or church towers, calling coordinates directly by radio. Their signals leap from unit to unit through the network, and somewhere, far behind, a battery they've never seen unleashes salvation. The Germans are stunned. Their offensive depends on overwhelming fixed defenses, but there are none. Instead, they face a ghostly defense in motion, a line that bends, retreats, reforms, and keeps firing. Reports flood German divisional HQs. Enemy artillery shifting, constantly impossible to locate. One officer writes that the Americans fight like smoke. We strike and they reform behind us. What none of them realize is that the U.S. command has deliberately orchestrated this fluidity. General Bruce C. Clark at St. Vith and General Troy Middleton farther south understand that artillery will decide the battle. They issue one overriding order: keep the guns moving, but keep them firing. By December 19th, the German advance had slowed dramatically. The panzers are running low on fuel, but their deeper problem is unseen. Their armored columns can't mass without being shelled. Every attempt to form up draws precise, simultaneous fire from American batteries hidden miles away. And in the skies above, the weather begins to break. U.S. observation planes, the small, unarmored Piper L-4 grasshoppers, take to the air again, marking targets for artillery that has by now shifted dozens of times. From the German side, it looks like black magic. One moment, the American positions are gone. The next, the forest explodes with new barrages. By the third week of December, entire German formations are pinned not by infantry or armor, but by artillery that refuses to stand still. The vanishing guns of the Ardennes have become the decisive force holding the line, but the climax is not yet over. As the battle deepens, American artillery will perform its boldest maneuvers, yet moving through chaos, firing from surrounded pockets and delivering barrages that would shatter the German illusion of victory once and for all. By December 20th, 1944, the situation in the Ardennes had become chaotic. German tanks were deep in the Allied lines. Towns had fallen. Roads were choked with snow and wreckage, and entire American units were surrounded. Yet even amid disaster, the steady rhythm of artillery fire continued unbroken, organized, and relentless. In the fog-shrouded hills south of Bastogne, the 303rd Field Artillery Battalion, a segregated African-American unit armed with 150 5.5-meter howitzers, found itself trapped by the German advance. The order came: keep firing until out of shells or out of time. They did both. When the roads became impassable, the gunners loaded their remaining ammunition into trucks and retreated under fire, towing their guns through snow and mud. By the time the Germans reached their last known position, the Americans were already miles away, firing again from the next ridge. This pattern repeated everywhere across the front. The 2nd, 4th, and 9th Infantry Division's artillery groups formed mobile arcs of fire, constantly shifting their positions to avoid detection. Each unit used the same invisible playbook: pre-surveyed fallback sites, radio-linked coordination, and speed. The result was a living, breathing system of artillery that seemed to move with the rhythm of battle itself. One of the most dramatic examples came from the 406th Field Artillery Group, supporting the defense of Bastogne. As German armored divisions closed in, the 406th executed 3 complete relocations in less than 24 hours. They fired, disassembled, moved through the night, reassembled, and resumed firing before dawn. Each time they hit their targets with uncanny precision because the entire fire control network adjusted in real time. German commanders, bewildered by the scale of the counterfire, began to suspect that the Americans had secretly massed far more guns than reconnaissance suggested. Luftwaffe pilots sent to confirm positions returned with vague reports: smoke, tracks, flashes in the distance, but no fixed emplacements. In post-war interrogations, one German officer described the experience: "We would silence one American battery, or so we thought. Then another would open, and then 2 more. It was like fighting an army that could disappear." The illusion of endless firepower was not just psychological, it was logistical genius. Behind the front, truck convoys of ammunition raced across icy roads under blackout conditions. Engineers worked through the night clearing routes and bridging craters. Signal units laid and relayed hundreds of miles of telephone wire through snow and forest. Every moving part of this machine existed to sustain the artillery's ability to strike anywhere, anytime. Meanwhile, in Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division was encircled, artillery became the lifeline. Batteries from the 969th Field Artillery Battalion and elements of the 10th Armored Division fired continuously, using every shell available. When German tanks approached, they switched to direct fire, aiming their howitzers straight at advancing armor. Then, as fuel ran low, the batteries broke contact again and moved, setting up in new positions that the enemy didn't even know existed. By December 23rd, the weather cleared completely, and Allied air power returned, but the artillery had already blunted the offensive. The fluid gun lines had prevented German formations from massing. Instead of a decisive breakthrough, the Wehrmacht now faced fragmented attacks, bogged down in terrain pulverized by American shells. General Patton's Third Army, rushing north to relieve Bastogne, relied on this same artillery flexibility. As his columns advanced, mobile battalions followed just minutes behind, unlimbering and firing in near real time. The combination of speed, coordination, and precision broke the rhythm of the German offensive. On December 26th, Patton's lead units broke through to Bastogne. By then, the myth of vanishing artillery had spread across the German front. Soldiers whispered that the Americans had some kind of invisible rail network to move their guns underground. Others simply called it Hexenfeuer, witchfire. In truth, it was neither magic nor witchcraft. It was a triumph of discipline and innovation, a culmination of years of doctrine, training, and relentless adaptation. American artillery had done the impossible, fought a mobile war with weapons once thought immobile. By early January 1945, the Bulge was collapsing. The snow that had once concealed the German advance now reflected the thunder of Allied counterfire. From Bastogne to Houffalize, the valleys echoed with the same sound that had terrified the enemy since Normandy, the methodical rhythm of U.S. artillery that could not be pinned down. When the guns finally fell silent, the forest was a graveyard of burned armor and shattered trees. The Germans had thrown their last punch, and it was stopped not by walls or tanks but by artillery that refused to stand still. When the Ardennes offensive finally stalled in early January 1945, silence returned to the forests, but it was not peace. The ground was littered with twisted steel and frozen bodies. Entire villages had been erased, reduced to blackened shells. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great gamble in the West, had failed. The numbers told the story of disaster. Over 100,000 German casualties, including dead, wounded, and captured. Nearly 700 tanks and assault guns were destroyed. The Wehrmacht's armored divisions, once feared for their lightning speed, were now stranded without fuel, surrounded by shattered infrastructure and relentless Allied artillery. On the Allied side, the toll was staggering but survivable. Roughly 80,000 casualties, one of the highest counts of the war for the United States. Yet what emerged from that carnage was a new understanding of warfare. Commanders reviewing the battle noted something remarkable. Throughout the entire Ardennes campaign, American artillery had maintained operational control, even while infantry and armor units were fragmented. It was the glue that held the front together with the single thread that connected chaos into coordination. Reports from the 1st and 3rd U.S. armies confirmed that artillery had been responsible for over 80% of all German losses during the battle. The reason wasn't firepower alone, it was the mobility of that firepower. Guns that refused to stay where the enemy expected them, positions that changed before counter-battery fire could land. Each shell seemed to arrive from a new direction, breaking morale before it broke bodies. Captured German officers later admitted that their troops could no longer trust their maps. One colonel from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division confessed during interrogation, "It was as if the Americans had found a way to move the earth itself. We fired at ghosts." What the Germans didn't understand was that they weren't fighting ghosts, they were fighting a doctrine. The U.S. Army had turned its artillery into a networked organism, using forward observers, radar spotting, air coordination, and flexible command. For every battery that disappeared into fog, there were a dozen support units behind it. Truck drivers, wire teams, mechanics, engineers, all ensuring that when the guns reappeared, they were ready to fire within minutes. It was logistics as warfare, and in that domain America had no equal. In the ruined towns of the Ardennes, civilians emerged from cellars to find that the front had shifted again. One moment they had been under German occupation, the next under American control. To them, the guns were the voice of liberation thunder that rolled west to east, pushing the enemy away mile by mile. By the second week of January, Allied High Command recognized the full scale of what had been achieved. The disappearing artillery tactic, the constant relocation and coordinated firing system, was credited not only with breaking the German offensive, but also with accelerating the counterattack. Eisenhower's staff officially designated it as a model for future operations, calling it Fluid Fire Doctrine. This doctrine would define the final months of the war. As the Allies advanced into Germany, artillery units no longer waited for battle lines to stabilize. They moved with the front, establishing positions in open fields, industrial ruins, and even on the move along roads. When the enemy counterattacked, the guns were already gone and new fire would come from miles away. But amid this triumph, there was exhaustion. Many artillerymen had fired so continuously through December and January that they suffered hearing loss, frostbite, and physical collapse. Their hands were cracked and burned from freezing shell casings, their eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights under constant bombardment. And yet, when asked how they endured, their answers were the same: because someone out there was counting on our fire. The men who vanished into the snow had become the heartbeat of a moving army. In the months that followed the Ardennes, the shock of defeat rippled through the German High Command. The failure of Unternehmen. Wacht am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge, was more than a lost offensive. It was the collapse of faith in German battlefield superiority. For years, the Wehrmacht had prided itself on initiative, speed, and precision. But now, in the bitter cold of early 1945, it was the Americans who moved faster. Their artillery no longer functioned as a static branch of the army. It was a living, maneuvering force. The Germans, who once perfected the blitzkrieg, now faced the firepower equivalent of their own creation. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overseeing the Western Front, wrote in a post-war report that American artillery functioned as if guided by one mind. He noted bitterly that German divisions were destroyed not by encirclement, but by dispersion of fire so vast that coordination became impossible. In Berlin, Hitler's reaction was furious denial. He blamed weather, fuel shortages, and what he called cowardly commanders. But inside the OKW, German High Command, generals quietly circulated analysis papers describing the new Allied technique, the rolling grid of artillery support. These reports concluded that it was this, not tanks or air power, that broke the offensive's spine. The Allies, meanwhile, wasted no time codifying what they had learned. From January to March 1945, the U.S. Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill began compiling post-battle evaluations. Officers returning from the front described the key lesson in simple terms. Mobility equals survival. Coordination equals victory. They documented how moving guns between multiple pre-surveyed firing points kept them alive longer and allowed more flexible support for fast-moving units. For the first time in modern warfare, artillery was fighting as maneuver warfare, something previously reserved for tanks and infantry. This doctrinal leap carried forward into the final Allied push into Germany. As the Rhine crossings began in March, artillery battalions operated like a relay system, one group firing, another on the move, and a third already preparing coordinates for the next phase. The enemy never had time to regroup. Every German attempt to form a defensive line was met with a storm of shells from positions that hadn't existed an hour earlier. German soldiers began to describe the experience in their diaries. We could not breathe between barrages. The guns hunted us like wolves. To them, the sky itself seemed to move, the explosions shifting with their retreat, always ahead, always near. By April 1945, this method of warfare had evolved even further. American artillery was fully integrated with tactical air power, creating a unified strike network with planes, tanks, and guns moving as one organism. When Hitler's Reich finally fell on May 8, 1945, the artillery's role was clear. It had made every German advance impossible, every counterattack suicidal. The German generals captured after the war admitted that they had underestimated the Americans. Not their courage that had been proven, but their adaptability. The same army that had once been clumsy and uncoordinated in 1942 had, by 1945, become a master of movement and logistics. One interrogated staff officer summarized the change best. The Americans learned war faster than we could teach it to them. In the shattered remains of the Ardennes, the forests slowly regrew. The villages were rebuilt, but buried beneath the soil were the twisted remains of howitzers, ammunition crates, and burned truck relics of an invisible battle fought through fog and precision. For the men who had served those guns, there was no monument, no grand parade. Their victory was measured in silence, in the absence of enemy fire, in the sudden quiet that came after their barrages ended. They had been unseen warriors in a war of movement and sound, and through their mastery, the world witnessed the birth of a new kind of warfare, one where information, timing, and mobility mattered as much as courage itself. The age of stationary battle had ended. The world's armies would never fight the same way again. In war, disappearance is often a sign of defeat. When an army vanishes, it usually means it's broken, scattered, or destroyed. But in the winter of 1944, American artillery rewrote that truth. Their disappearance wasn't surrender, it was transformation. They learned to move faster than fear, to strike from the unseen, to adapt in the space between chaos and control. In that frozen world of fog, snow, and thunder, the artillerymen of the U.S. Army showed that survival in modern warfare belongs not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. The Germans, who once believed they owned the science of maneuver, watched as their own tactics were used against them, not through cunning or luck, but through precision and discipline. The Americans had become masters of the invisible battlefield, a place defined not by trenches or front lines, but by speed, coordination, and the will to endure. Every shell fired in those weeks carried more than explosives. It carried proof that technology and human resolve could merge into something unstoppable. The vanishing guns were not ghosts. They were the embodiment of a new idea, that intelligence and movement were as deadly as firepower itself. In the decades that followed, armies around the world would study those battles, tracing the birth of mobile fire doctrine, networked command, and rapid logistics, the foundation of modern warfare. But behind every theory, every manual, every chart of range and timing, there remained the image of those men in the snow, exhausted, silent, moving their guns through darkness to fire once more. They left no statues, no fame, no poetry. Yet their work shaped the outcome of the greatest war in history. When the smoke cleared and Europe lay quiet again, the lesson of the hour